officer comes in and is willing to compromise. The officer generally is there, and their incentive may be less discipline or no discipline, because they're in a process of mediating the situation. Unfortunately, when citizens come in, a lot of times the only thing is termination. They don't see anything else. It's all termination. And now understanding that the majority of the complaints that are made in my office are not terminatable offenses, because a part of the disciplinary process is a penalty schedule and a civil service and a lot of other things that in my 10 or 15 minutes is hard to explain. But we have a process of discipline with officers that is my office is the beginning. Then at that point we have a board that is housed of deputy chiefs or commanders of a district that may have a hearing for that officer to determine the merits of the investigation that I've conducted. And at that point, the hearing lends itself a recommendation in reference to discipline, whether it's 30 days, whether it's 1 day, whether it's a letter of reprimand, or it's highest termination. At that point, that board recommends to the chief of police, who is the ultimate person that has to make the decision on discipline and the final decision maker, or the arbitrator of discipline. He has to either concur or reject that recommendation. And that is, in a nutshell, the majority of our disciplinary process. Is a lot more complicated than that, a lot more involved. I want to make sure that I give you time to ask questions, because if I maybe give you that opportunity, then we can specifically deal with some of the things that citizens have in general as a thought process, or how you look at discipline, or how you look at the Public Integrity Bureau. Most people I find don't know what a Public Integrity Bureau is. Most people don't know how to make a complaint. So that's a part of what our process is just to educate the public on where you make complaints, how to make complaints, and what things are truly complaints. And part of that would be having a better understanding of policing in general. Any questions so far? Go ahead.
So I have a couple of questions, but one, I was wondering if you had the number of complaints, or just a ballpark, that were sustained, and then the number that were, you said NVO?
Yeah.
No violation observed?
No, I wouldn't have that off the top of my head, because it changes for different years in terms of sustained. But I can tell you that if you were going with a percentage, the majority of complaints fall in a category of either not sustained, info, NVO. Smaller percentage are actually sustained, but we do have a nice percentage of sustained complaints. But because if you're talking about over 1,600 complaints in general, and let's say only roughly 200 to 300 were actual formal investigations, meaning they actually lended themselves to a full-fledged formal investigation because the allegation was within policy. Full investigation had to be conducted to determine the merits of it, and then by the time you get to the end of it, I would say, I don't want to guess, but it's a nice percentage that are actually end up sustained because there's so many different categories that complaints can be classified in. When you get into that formal, generally it's enough after the intake unit has looked at it that a lot of those complaints end up sustained, because what the intake unit is housed with doing is generally within that first 48 hours to the first week when it's still with intake, they're charged with getting the preliminary information. So let's say an individual comes in and says that they were subject to use of force, and this is someone who actually was arrested. So I can easily go and get the video from the sheriff's office, where normally you're not accepted if you have extreme injuries or something that causes you to need to seek medical attention. So if someone comes in and alleges that they needed medical attention, they were severely injured by an officer, then I also find out that they were arrested on that same day, and I get video that doesn't corroborate that, then of course there's a whole other element of investigation, but it may not lead to the force investigative team because it looks like initially it may be a false complaint. So that's what that intake unit does, is that they go through the process of gathering video and any evidence I may need within a 24 to 48 hour process, because a lot of video, even that different individuals use on their homes or different businesses use, have a 48-hour loop where they start taping over the tape. So basically, once somebody comes in, the immediate thing I will do is send a team out to surveil, see if there's any surveillance video, see if there's any other evidence, look for any witnesses to the potential allegation, to try to substantiate, first of all, whether in fact I have a legitimate complaint. And after that, we go through a full process. All of them have to be fully investigated, whether initially we don't get a lot of information or not. I still have to go through a long, arduous process of corroborating or either determining that the officer is exonerated or determining in fact that something happened.
And on the mediation part of it, like if you bring an officer and a complaint together to mediate, that is separate from discipline here, right?
Yes, well, that's why I was talking when I was asking you earlier, because a part of what everybody has to figure out is where it falls in the process. I'm gonna tell you what my vision is of where it would appropriately fall because of the constraints we have in terms of how the process works. Mediation technically probably can happen at any point before the discipline is imposed. At that point, I don't know that there's any incentive for the officer to mediate. Before that process, let's say the complainant comes in and lodges an investigation or lodges a complaint. The officer at some point is notified of the complaint. The officer is notified that the complaint, not necessarily of the complainant or who the person is, but that the complaint has been lodged against the officer. So at that point, similar to EOC, which I worked a lot with, once you get that allegation in, then you've noticed the officer. What would seem appropriate is similar to what EOC does, send out that letter to request if mediation is even appropriate. If it falls within whatever constraints we put on this, which I would suggest is gonna be minimal in terms of the type of discipline that would fall within this type of mediation program. Definitely wouldn't be anything of criminal nature, it would only be administrative. And believe it or not, we probably have a vast majority of actual complaints that would end up falling under mediation, because a number of the complaints are what I consider complaints that are within that 10 to letter reprimand time frame in terms of the possibility of discipline. That an officer can only be disciplined up to so many days because of the type of complaint. The majority of them are professional courtesy. And that's why this community policing is so imperative, is that if some of the cell-stop community policing and all the things we've been talking about, we start doing more and more on the front end, then it will eliminate, for me and for the department, a lot of work on what I consider minor complaints. No complaint is minor to the complainant. But for us, when I have to deal with potentially criminal and large types of misconduct within the department, it'd be wonderful if we got to a point where the relationships got and the community policing worked to the point where an officer and the interaction with the citizen lends itself to the citizen getting a real explanation of why the police officer is taking whatever action, and that citizen at that point leaves with satisfied with that interaction. A number of people that come into my office is because I would say 60% of my complaints are professionalism. A feeling of the way they were treated, the way they were spoken to, the officer didn't explain what he was doing, he didn't explain why. That's the complaint all the time. I don't necessarily know that it's always accurate or it's always true, but that is the complaint. And a number of times I find that, in fact, it has happened. They're very difficult for me to prove. You have the officer's word against the citizen. And a number of times what I've seen, even in these few mediations that I've held, is that it went so well, I was thinking to myself, well, if the officer had talked in the beginning, we might not be here. Mm-hmm. Or it could be similar to what I was saying earlier, there's such hostility in that initial meeting that it's very difficult for anybody to get to what I consider a mediation point in the beginning.
I guess what I was trying to visualize, for example, let's say the officer did something. The way the officer behaved was inappropriate.
Yes.
So it might be sustained if
Yes.
it went further.
Yes. Yes.
The citizen comes in, the citizen in this process of them dialoguing, even though the officer as a professional person had a higher responsibility to
Correct.
act in a certain way.
Absolutely.
The complainant in this conversation with this other human being realizes I wasn't too right either. And I kind of jerked this
I've had that.
up
Yeah.
the chain
Yeah.
myself.
Yes.
And as, you know, person to person,
Yes.
it kind of is, well, you know, you wasn't right, I wasn't right, you know, I'm sorry, you're
Yes.
sorry.
Yes.
Forget about it.
Yes.
Or you have the thing, and the other thing would happen, nah, this guy, he ain't for real, and I'm not feeling you on that, I'm going to the next level. And then we just go back to the disciplinary thing as a failed mediation.
Right, what has to be thought through, and I'm still a little fuzzy on it as I'm trying to figure out the framework, as I try to help with the framework, is that, yes, of course, with a failed mediation, you go right into the disciplinary process. The question is, what happens with the successful one? Let me tell you why. I have to think about that I actually have a complaint. This is actually a valid complaint. There's been a breach of policy. The complainant and the police officer, they come together and talk about it, and there's basically an understanding or a meeting of the minds, and the complainant feels like at this point, okay, I'm satisfied that I had this discussion. The question is, are you also satisfied that no discipline is imposed after that? Does, you know, that meaning, is it appropriate for no discipline to be imposed? Because I also have a process through an early warning system of tracking and understanding the patterns of officers. So if you put in a mediation process that, in a sense, may say that if Captain Glasser is accused of professionalism, and I'm thinking of this in terms of just minor type of complaints, accused of professionalism, that may be an easier one, because to me, that's one where if we meet, we talk, and the individual kind of says, you know what, Chief, I was kind of up there, police officer, I felt like it was unprofessional, but in reality, he was really just trying to get control of me. I really just lost it. And that's a different type. I can see that kind of going away. That's one of those where we had a misunderstanding. We got together, and once we talked about it, we understood it. What's a little bit more difficult for me is when someone comes in and actual breach of policy beyond professionalism. Let's say an officer, for whatever reason, really, you had an encounter with, you had a traffic stop, it's appropriate based on policy to have filled out a field interview card, we failed to do that. So we have this interaction where we feel better about the discussions that we've had, but the question is now that I found some breach of policy, me as a manager, me as the deputy superintendent of public integrity, and the purpose in discipline is to correct behavior. Is it enough just to have the mediation without any form of discipline, is the question. And that would be best answered, you know, from the unions and all of us as we talk about, you have to think through what happens with those particular type of mediations and what is going to be the incentive. The incentive for me when we talk about settlement processes is what we are talking about with the unions now, where I'm talking to the Fraternal Order of Police about how to put a settlement package together, which may mean that if I go through a process of a complaint coming in and an officer is willing to just admit to what happened. You don't put me through an investigation, you don't put me through a formal investigation, you admit, I messed up, Chief. Yes, I did this, I did that. So with that would be a settlement in that, let's say the discipline normally would be 5 days. You make it 3 days because I don't have to do an investigation. There's still some discipline, you still have some consequence to your action, you still have some ability to correct your action based on something resulted from it, but because you, unlike another officer who decided to go through the entire process, let me have to prove it, he may get 5, you get 3 days. So those are some of the things we've been talking about. That's a little bit outside of mediation, but it's still kind of a part. All of it kind of has to come together. And the one theme is that an officer has to have an incentive to sit down and do it.
Actually,
Good. Captain. Good.
actually, what you propose actually is part of mediation. Like the next stage, when you come, and I believe some lady kind of hinted toward the little early advocate.
Okay.
Where you come to the point, you have the party, the mediation, and then, okay, you hashed out, we come to that mutual ground, and now it's split into negotiations. This is where the community can feel a little bit more empowerment in terms of, with that example, give it 3 to 5 days. So there's always an objective to mediation.
Well, the reason I was asking is because when I first, me as a lawyer understands the normal mediation process and how you have binding versus non-binding mediations and how you come and you actually negotiate and you negotiate what the result is going to be.
Yeah.
When we talked earlier, because you have civil service, you have a lot of things that you have to research. You have a lot of different dynamics. The question is, how binding is it going to be? Meaning, you sit down through a mediation process. That's the reason that I believe that my process has to either be separate or pulled in. Part of what we've understood is that when I do this settlement package and agreement, I need to have it approved by the civil service. And it has to be a part of a process that means that once Captain Glasser and I sit down and make an agreement, that now that's it. The case for us as a department, the only benefit it will be for me is that the appeal rights end. And the reason that mediation helps the department and it helps me if we do settlements is because when you have that number of investigations in a year, it makes it very difficult to focus on real misconduct. There's real misconduct that I like the department to focus on, and what I mean by focus on is my resources are charged with those full investigations and a number of these minor instances where officers need to be retrained, officers need to learn from their behavior and learn from the experience how to correct their behavior, that process is separate and apart, and it takes some of the burden off of this larger process, which is when I'm driven by a consent decree, I'm driven by a lot of things that we're trying to do in terms of reforming the department. There's going to be a lot that we have to focus on as a unit for the first time. And I'd like to be able to drive many of those larger investigations and a lot of my resources into that, similar to other internal affairs offices all across the country. They're able, from an intake perspective, to send some people away. In New Orleans, as a part of the earlier years of our reform and transparency, we made a policy decision that every citizen that comes in, we're taking all those complaints. With that, though, is a huge burden in terms of resources, a huge burden in terms of every single investigation still has to be adjudicated, unlike other places where if you walk in the door and you don't allege some form of misconduct, then they send you away. But with me, I have to investigate everything that comes through the door.
So I just thought like shooting forward, fast forward into my mind.
Okay.
To the end stage of mediation and taking into consideration all the settlement
Yes,
process
yes,
you outlined.
yes, yes.
And which,
Because, no, we're running out of time, that's the only reason I was, but I think that's an interesting point. And one of our models, I believe it was Pittsburgh, did include a mediation
Yes.
agreement at the
Yes.
end of mediation.
Yes.
And the discipline depended on whether or not that agreement was fulfilled.
Correct.
So that's definitely something we should consider. For now, though, I want to hear from Captain Glasser before we close this section. And I'm going to offer that we give everyone 2 weeks. If there's any additional questions for Chief Westbrook, you can submit those to me in the next 2 weeks. I will get them to Chief Westbrook and I will post her answers in our discussion group so that we can move forward.
One more thing I wanted to share. A part of this task, as you know, is going to be setting up our requirements for the mediation, what can go in front of mediation. I'm in the process of reaching out to civil service to see if we can get maybe some type of documentation showing their processes, what can we even use for mediation, or see if they can come out and do a presentation, something like Chief Westbrook. So then we'll have that information also. So I know a lot of people are asking questions about that. I'm just waiting to get approval of who to send it to, and then we'll see what they say. So
Just to gauge a little bit, I don't know if civil service would be the appropriate body for that. It would have to be internal to the department as to what is appropriate for mediation or not. All civil service, the
But I just
only.
want to get like the process of civil service. A lot of
I got
citizens,
you.
I know a lot of people here don't understand
The
that civil
appeal
service
process,
has a
yeah.
large part of what goes
Correct,
on
correct.
with the with discipline. So
Okay.
I was just trying to get that information to people that can also help with our decision making and things like that.
Without drilling down too hard on technical details, because obviously that hasn't worked out further down the road around here. And without trying to undermine Webster on this, but I think the entire idea behind mediation is that nobody really walks away with everything they want.
Correct.
And nobody walks away with nothing.
Correct.
And that's the whole point of mediation. So going into the process, realistically, important. I think for the citizens in many cases, and I think Sue pointed out, that a lot of times a lot of our complaints are, I just don't like the way the officer handled it.
Yeah.
I didn't like his tone, I didn't like his attitude, he didn't say anything wrong, he didn't say anything vulgar, he didn't say anything really bad, I just don't like the way he handled it. And what they get out of mediation is the ability to tell the officer that to his face.
Right.
And have that officer explain to him why he said, it, or at least hear it, maybe even apologize if in fact it came across that way. And sometimes it may not be remembered. The benefit to the officer is exactly that. There may be a penalty that is mitigated in some form or fashion that is his incentive to do the same thing. So everybody walks away with something. And very often, if it's a complaint where you just don't like the way you handle it, the officer says, well, I didn't say anything bad. We've had complaints where officers are accused of, I didn't like his facial expression. He gave me a scowl. He didn't look at me. There's nothing that PIB is going to be able to do with that, quite honestly. And he may very well have done that, okay? You know, there's a right way of saying it and a wrong way. You can say yes, sir. You can say yes, sir, okay? And it come out entirely